Welcome to I Rise Conversations with Joan. Welcome to another exciting episode of I Rise Conversations with Joan. Today we have the honor of a remarkable guest, Rob Eschman. He is a distinguished professor, an author, a filmmaker, and a scholar who is at the forefront of exploring the intersection of technology, racism, and resistance in the digital age. Rob's most recent work, his book titled When the Hood Comes Off, Racism and Resistance in the Digital Age, is a testament to his dedication to shedding light on the transformative impact of technology and online communication on our experiences and responses to racism. His extensive research and insights delve into uncovering the barriers to racial and economic equity at both the individual, group, and institutional levels. His work emphasizes the heroic efforts that everyday people make in the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality. Welcome, Rob, to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here. So before we dive into all things racism, tell us a little bit about your background and why you chose to embark on this journey.
Yeah. I was born and raised in Chicago. I think I grew up in a pretty multicultural neighborhood, East Rogers Park in Chicago. It was about a third Black, a third Latinx, a third immigrant communities from other places. And you're right, and so I had my own set of experiences growing up where I was in majority, around folks of color in my neighborhood, but then I went to schools where I was around a majority white students. And so kind of that contrast growing up, and I think that that gave me a certain sensibility about racial differences, where I would see differences in my home neighborhood versus where I was going to school. I think that I started thinking about, so I went to get my PhD to study education reform, and one of the things that drove me there was actually reading a book called Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol, which really points at differences in funding levels between urban and suburban schools, and how that drives educational inequality, and then also economic inequality years later. And so that was heavy on my mind, and it made me reflect on some of my experiences in high school, where I would see the resource differential between my high school and other high schools, or even my neighborhood high school, where I was going to kind of a magnet type school where you have to test to get in. And so it was a Chicago public school, but we had money like a suburban school, right? And just kind of seeing that, the hallways feel happier here because the lights are brighter, and that those type of things make a difference on student outcomes. And so that really is what drove me to become a scholar, is wanting to understand, why school reforms continue to, that it seems like they're failing, that we still have this racial gap, and then wanting to be a part of the process of change. And so I think that for me, this like what I've been studying recently, and what this book is about, what When the Hood Comes Off is about, is the ways that technology changes how we experience race and racism. And that project for me began as I learned about how the expressions of racism had been changing over the past, decades, since the end of the Jim Crow era and the classic years of the Civil Rights Movement. And then, how that contrasted with my own experiences online, whether it's from playing video games to seeing comments on YouTube videos. And I just wanted to understand, what was it about online communication that allows people to feel more comfortable expressing open racism? And then also, what impact does that have on folks of color? How do we think about those things? How does it change the way that we understand racism in the world? And then maybe most importantly is, how do we respond to that, kind of those increases in open racism, or the increased visibility of racism, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, well, awesome story. And I could definitely relate to a lot of the things that you shared, being an immigrant myself and moving from Nigeria to the West. I moved to the UK and saw racism in a different color, and now I live in Toronto in Canada, and it's different as well. And I think at this point, for some of us, we might be numb to it, but you're kind of shining the light on some of these things that we might be ignoring and could be very damaging to marginalized people and people of minority descent. So talking about your book, When the Hood Comes Off, so you really, really focus on the impact of technology on racism. Can you share specific examples of some of how you feel technology has impacted? I dare to say only negatively. I think it's been both ways. So maybe both positively and negatively when it comes to racial inequalities.
Yeah. So, the thing like I started the study with a case study of a college campus-based website that allowed students to submit anonymous comments. And this turned into a place where, everybody knew it to be horribly racist and homophobic. But while there are many places online where you can find racism and homophobia, the difference is online, you don't know where it's coming from. And whereas this website, you had to be a student to contribute, but then the moderator, anonymized the comments. And so that what that meant is that that these horrible things are coming from people in your community, as opposed to being able to say, oh, this must be coming from the South, that these are folks in Texas or Alabama, and that's not where I am right now, right? That you couldn't have these assumptions about where racism lives, and it really challenged the assumptions about where racism lives. And so that's an example of right things being posted online that are different than what you experience every day. That when I talk to students of color about the site, they mentioned, feeling unsure of their white friends when they're sitting in the dining hall, looking to the right and to the left and wondering, were you one of the people who posted on the site, or the people in their dorms, their roommates, the people in their classrooms? And it challenged their worldview, whereas they were living right on a campus where there were friendly race relations for the most part. This made them realize that the friendliness in everyday interactions may hide, bias or hatred under the surface. And so that is an example of how online we can have the exposure of racist ideas that we may not be able to see in our everyday lives. Now, there are some people who are able to understand and recognize subtle forms of racism, but that's just not everyone. And for the people who understand subtle racism, this website was more of a validation. Like, see, I told y'all that this is where we're at in society, when you were trying to tell us that we're past race. And so, right, so depending on kind of where you are developmentally, you may have a different interpretation. But that's a lot of what I do in part one of the book, is try to understand, where is racism hiding? How do we find it? How does the internet expose it and make it more visible than it has been? And then part two of the book is about resistance. And so when you say positive and negative, right, I think that's what you're getting to, is this idea of, on the negative, it can amplify racism, make it more explicit. On the positive side of things, something that was unexpected, right? I did not go into the study to study resistance, but I was surprised to find the students of color I talked to were not, backing away, not using the internet because they were scared of racism. They were using online tools in order to challenge racism, maybe, and in some cases more than they did in their everyday lives and face-to-face situations. And so just that online communication can make it easier to challenge things like racism or microaggressions, where you're not alone. Yeah, right. If you're the only student of color in a classroom and something comes up, then that's a burden that's on your back, where people are looking at you and you have to decide, am I going to be am I going to speak up for my race right now? Versus in online settings, when these things happen in places where more people in the community can see, that there's less individual responsibility on any one person of color, and you have more communal or collective responses to racism. And so that is for me, the most exciting parts of the book are the parts where we are witnessing how young people, without any institutional support, without guidance necessarily from older generation, are coming up with new ways to challenge racism that I think really can turns racism for a loop when it's used to getting away with these things in silence. That folks of color don't feel silenced online, and that means that they're able to speak out much more often.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wow. So that's very interesting to learn that resistance, that the folks of color are not resistant. They're speaking up as well. They're challenging racism when they see it online. So I know we all love to hate the social media platforms, but I feel like these platforms are probably the biggest number one perpetrators of these kind of racial situations. And what advice or what recommendation would you have? Because I think that kids even way younger now are being exposed to racism. And I've seen racism at 5-year-old, 6-year-old. I'm like, how? Where are these kids learning this stuff from? Right. So, what are some of the ways that maybe as parents they can protect their kids or teach them how they can kind of fight back or challenge racism and how to deal with it? For me, I know racism does exist. I know it's there, but two wrongs don't make a right. So I feel like the way you approach it as well is very, very key. So what are some of the tips that you can share with people, maybe people who have experienced racism, maybe people who are being trolled online today? How
Mm-hmm.
can they handle it in a way that it doesn't aggravate the tension?
That is a good question. Now, in terms of aggravating the tension, I think that that is often how we think about these things is how do we respond without getting someone upset? And I think the part of the spirit of what clapping back online looks like is that sometimes you don't care if you're aggravating the tension. And that may be the point, is that this is a moment where I am no longer more concerned about how you feel than how I feel. Because when we're concerned about what white people think, when right they're being right when they may do something that is hurtful to us and we don't want to be right we don't want to offend them by pointing out how what they did is hurtful, that means that we are privileging their peace over our own, and that has an effect on us. That there's loads of research that point out the ways that experiencing subtle forms of racism over time, this right that makes us more stressed. It increases mental health symptoms of depression and anxiety. It's harmful to us, right? It shortens our lives. And so I think that that is part of the spirit online, is that folks are clapping back and they're not worried about the feelings of the microaggressor. They're telling them, no, this is racist, here's why, and that's up for you to figure out, is how to not be that way moving forward. And so I think that that is something that's powerful, is that first of all is a questioning of, should we be so concerned with the way white people feel that we don't tell them when they are acting in harmful ways? And I think I respect folks, if you can expect someone to be defensive, that I respect, the idea of, okay, let's be strategic here so that we can have a real conversation instead of this person shutting down the way I would anticipate them. I think that that's a smart way to do it, and I like that thinking. But then, first of all, I just want to back up and say we don't always have to avoid the problem. The problem is there, and us saying something is not making it a bigger problem. It is just pointing out the problem. And so the emotions that follow are not necessarily our fault if the person you're talking to is not receptive. Now, as a parent, right? So that's kind of part one here. As a parent, I think, right, I'm a parent, and one thing I've done is I just try to, when my kids are playing video games, I change the settings. I say, whose voice is that? Like, is that a friend? Do you know that person? Because the setting is you can't hear any strangers. I'm not trying to hear a strange grown up talking to my kids when they're playing Fortnite. And so I think that that's something we can do, is just be mindful of settings like that, right? Like I think that, back in my day, my generation of folks, we were exposed to all types of ugliness of racism playing video games online. One of the things I talk about in the book, and there weren't really options for moderation, and it was just something that we had to find our own way, and our parents didn't know what was happening. I think nowadays parents who have had more experiences with technology in their lives, that you right we can figure out the settings to protect our kids a little bit. Now, I also don't think that we can do that perfectly. I think that our kids are going to be exposed to things no matter what. And so for me, what I try to do is, because I know I can't anticipate everything, I just want to have an open relationship with my kids where they feel comfortable sharing with me things that happen. And that has happened for me, right? Where I have my child come and tell me, yeah, when I was using the VR headset, then I heard some people using racist language. I was like, oh, okay. Thank you for telling me. I didn't know that on the VR headset there was a public chat function. Now I know, we're going to fix it, right? And so it's like I just want them to be able to come talk to me about those types of things. And to be honest, as a parent, I don't necessarily have a curriculum of prepping them for what racism may look like at different stages. I guess one exception is thinking about driving and giving the talk and how to interact with the police and whatnot, and with a traffic stop. But apart from that, for me, it is just answering their questions honestly when they come up. And I think that as they get older, it's coming up more and more. And I've always answered the questions from my oldest child in front of my youngest child, and so that he's getting the advanced answer, and I'm never holding back. I'm never giving a kid answer, and I'm never pretending. And I think that's the main thing, is just being open with our kids about the world that we live in. And I think that preparing them for bias and helping them to understand that racism is a problem that is not about you. It doesn't live in us. It is a problem over there, right? It is the problem of the people who are behind racism. I think that that's important for maintaining their esteem when they inevitably have these negative experiences, is to know that has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with any qualities you have. It is not your fault. It is their fault. And this is a sickness that we're trying to fix. And that's why we're going to this protest together, is because racism is a problem in society, and we want to be on the side of the people who are working to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Is it fixable though?
Ooh, man, I do believe that it is. I think that we have seen incremental progress, but then still some progress. I think that I do maintain hope in the world becoming better and not worse. I think that it's difficult to imagine change, but if you look back at examples of how the world has changed over over the past hundreds of years, and like what is in common is that it's when everyday people band together and we come and we demand something different than what we have become accustomed to. And I think that is part of the long-term organizing, is how do we build everyday people's capacity to be change agents, where this is not about waiting for the next Martin Luther King. It is about relying on the Ella Bakers who are out there training people to think critically about our system, and that to imagine a new world where things don't look how they look now. So an example of this, in the last chapter of my book, When the Hood Comes Off, I do a keyword searches of millions of tweets over a decade period, seeing how conversations have changed. One of those searches is abolition. Mm-hmm. And abolition comes from this idea that prison reform doesn't work, prisons don't work. And abolition means we want to free all prisoners. We want to imagine a world where jails do not need to exist. What would society need to be? What supports would need to be in place? What resources would people need to have access to in order for us to not need prisons? And I think that something so that is something that has been a very seen as being a very radical theory, right? But abolition led to discussions of prison abolition led to are behind the calls to defund the police, which we have been hearing more and more since this organizing in Ferguson, right? And so in 2020, when we had the uprisings over the summer of 2020, that up to 80% of tweets about prison reform included the word abolition. So this term, which has been very, very far left, is becoming more mainstream because of organizers, activists, scholars, artists who are discussing who are encouraging us to imagine a radically different world than we live in now. And that's just one example of how, yes, like things that don't make sense as being possible are possible when we get together and work for it. Another example is reparations. One of the quotes of my book is a Black man talking about he's speaking about reparations with some of his friends, and a white woman laughed at him and punched him in the arm like, "You're so funny." And he's like, "I wasn't joking about that. I really want to talk about reparations. I think this is something we need in society." And it's laughable to most people to think that reparations could exist. But now there are over a dozen examples around the country of local reparations campaigns, where folks in small cities or mid-sized cities are being offered reparations based on historical injustices. It's right. This is an idea that we thought was crazy is now being tried, and we'll see what those experiments look like. And now, will that mean that it's going to happen on a national level tomorrow? Not necessarily, but it just shows that change is possible. So yes, I do think that it is possible to fix racism. No, I don't think it will happen overnight. No, I know that and it's not just about people's attitudes. It's about power structures, and people with money and power don't want to give up their money and power and privilege. And so it's right. It's more than just about everyday people and the way they think about race, and it's also about structures and how that really the racism supports capitalism, and that's a big part of the problem, is that this needs to be a systemic level change.
Absolutely. And I love what you said about everyday people kind of coming together to fight this common cause. And, when I think about the US, for instance, there's a large number of Black people, for as an example. But when you look at a country like Canada, I think now it's like 3%. And even within the 3%, the Africans and the Caribbeans don't see eye to eye. We don't believe that we're one, we're not the same. So that's a huge problem right there. So what would you say to countries like Canada, where the Black folks were really, really the minority? There's just too few of us. And where, someone might be saying, okay, well, that sounds all well and good. I want to be a change agent. I want to be part of this revolution that's happening. But when I look around, it's just me. How can they still do something in their small capacity or whatever it is they can do to kind of move this mission forward?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that first of all, I think that when you look at differences between Black communities, so whether it's West Indian versus African, whether it's immigrant Black populations versus native Black populations in America, and there are different dynamics in the U.S. versus Canada versus the U.K., and we read about these things, and it just shows us that that race is about socialization, that in different places that we have different experiences. Part of this, it makes me think about just the need for political education, that we need to build racial consciousness. And I think often some of the things that drive wedges between different elements of the Black community are racist narratives, that they're seeing another group as being representative of the problem. Oh, like, no, you all behave in a different way than us. Our culture is different. We don't want anything to do with you. And that is buying into white supremacy culture and the belief that some type of Black culture is inferior. And so I think that is something that needs to be addressed within Black communities, as well as being able to identify and question and challenge the moments in which we take on white supremacist attitudes and ideas towards other people who look like us, who are part of the African diaspora, but do not have the same experiences that we do. And so I think that's part of it, is how do we increase racial and political education in the Black community or the broader community. The other part is, I think, if I can steal from the book a little bit, it's easier to find communities online than in face-to-face settings when you feel that alone, when you're saying that the percentages are so small and it's hard for you to find a community in a face-to-face setting. I think the internet is a place you can find those communities. You can find that forum, you can find that blog that is really speaking to you, and that can be a starting place for your own kind of consciousness development, and finding ways to get involved. And I also think that is a way to get involved in face-to-face settings, is that that a lot of times in-person activist events, you find out about them online, I know that that seems to be where I find out about where we're meeting, is about through seeing what's happening on Twitter, seeing folks on my personal social media post links. And so I think that it's this combination of looking for the spaces online, looking for the spaces in person, and committing to this being a long-term change, even when there's not a hashtag that is getting media news. How can you find opportunities, find organizations to be a part of, in order to continue the fight even when it's not popular, in a sense of reporters wanting to talk about it every day.
Okay, that's good advice. Okay, so I know you mentioned about the well-being of the youth and some of the impacts of this digital racism that's going on. And some of my listeners may not be aware of some of these mental, emotional issues that are going on. So based on your research, what are some of the things that you have seen that is impacting the marginalized people?
And what do you mean by that in terms of mental and emotional?
So is it are the mental issues that are coming up from all of this digital racism that's going on based on your research? How is it affecting them emotionally? Is it affecting
Okay.
their their family life, their children, how they relate at work, their ability to apply for certain jobs? I saw that a lot, where when people felt shut down and that's it, they just constantly think I'm not good enough, and it affects them, and then depression sets in. They constantly second guessing themselves and all of that. But that's just my personal experience.
Yeah, no, no, no. That's a, your personal experience is valid. I think that first of all, there is a long history of the effects of racism in person on health and mental health and life expectancy and all these things. And so I think that we know that racism hurts us, whether it is overt or subtle. Racism has a negative effect on our lives, on how well we perform at work or in school, etc. And now we're finding research that racism online has the same effects. That experiencing racism online or in person, they're both harmful to our health. And so it's right. So it's not only racism online that hurts us; it's racism in both settings. But I think that when we think about how often people experience, you know, racism directed at them, how often they see racism, we may see it a little bit more online than we do in person. And now that's not the case for everyone, but I think that is something that a lot of folks I interviewed talk about, is that they see racism online every day, whereas racism in face-to-face settings is a little bit more rare. So I think the key here is that both forms of racism, online and in person, are having a negative impact. And when I that I think in terms of talking more about what that looks like. I think a lot of this stuff comes from surveys where you have measures where people are answering 10 questions. Is it hard for you to wake up in the morning? Right. We have a depression measure. We have a measure of anxiety. We have a measure of stress. And so in surveys, we're seeing that where you're not necessarily having conversations with people, with everyone about, oh, what does your depression look like? As much as it's like, look, we know that on average, more experiences with racism predict worse mental health. Now, in my book, I have interviews with over 80 students around the country. I do have a survey where I am looking at the effects of online racism on mental health. Then, of course, I have the social media data. I will say, from stories that I hear students talk about, I think that it can be, very, very, like students talk. So I'll give one example. There was a young Latinx woman, who was very involved as an activist at her university. And there was a racist incident that she reported and had meetings with the administrators and the people behind the racist incident. And after that process of devoting hours upon hours, right, she was very dissatisfied with the outcome. That she talked about the final day of, this is a meeting of us getting together, that the folks who had done something racist were asking her, so what have you learned from this experience? What are you like? How are you going to improve from this?
Wow.
Right. Right. And she just felt deflated and looked back on it, and her grade slipped because of how hard she was working to fight against this injustice. And she did not feel like the administration had her back. She felt like she was doing this alone. And then afterwards, she felt a sense of regret because nothing came from it, but she sacrificed, that she chose to give up her own time and effort and energy, right? In order to pursue justice, which she did not feel like she ultimately got. Now that is an example of the cost of, right, like, one, racism, and then two, fighting racism, that you, and feeling like your efforts come to nothing, right? Going back to your question of, can you actually fix this? Is this a problem we can fix? And one of the things I talk about in the chapter on organizing is how students perceive the differences between online and in-person organizing. Where online, they feel like they're able to accomplish more with less of a cost to their own mental health and time, because instead of being the only person doing it, it's easier to get more people involved and feel less pressure on yourself. You have time to step away. It's less time intensive. You can choose the moments in which you're engaging. And so that's not to say that in-person activism is not important, but it's just an example of how that in the case of some of the students I talked to, that they had hard experiences with activism in person, and then when you start moving activism online, that they're feeling like they're able to get many more people people involved, people who may not have had time to come to the meeting, but they do have time to read your post and show support.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna ask I'm in an interracial relationship, and so all my siblings, so we're all married to white folks. And I know that they all have good intentions in terms of how they can be allies and how they can support, and how maybe sometimes they make excuses for some of this racist situations that happen. But how can people who are in such relationships kind of manage this whole thing, because it can get very ugly very quickly, because if a conversation arises, then it's now someone has to take sides. You have to be more conscious of the words that you're saying, because you have a partner who is sitting on the other side of the fence, who's supposed to be, quote unquote, be the enemy. How can some of us manage such relationships? Because at the end of the day, not everybody is racist. And yes, some people are just ignorant, but some people are consciously doing it. How can we be a bit wiser or be more able to discern or have the right conversations so that our partners also feel they can be open with us and they can help maybe move this course forward as well?
I don't know that I can answer that question for you. I think that everyone is like the things that you need in a relationship, the things that you expect in a relationship, these things differ so much that I don't know that there's one answer for what to expect. I even think folks of color have different levels for kind of thresholds of microaggressions they're comfortable with, but there are some Black folks who don't feel offended at subtle forms of racism and don't believe that they're about race, and there are other Black folks who are very sensitive to racial microaggressions and feel like race is everywhere in their everyday interactions. So, right, the answer to your question is going to be very different depending on like what type of things people notice. I also think that in terms of the, it also depends on kind of your partner's sensibilities. And I think am not one to make assumptions that like a more woke white person is not necessarily less likely to engage in an unconscious form of racism. I think that we all have blind spots. And the nature of blind spots are that we don't see them, that you may identify as an anti-racist and then not recognize how you're contributing to racism in some part of your life, or with some attitude or idea that you have, and some assumption that you make, and so that is a difficult question. I don't have an answer to it. I did not write a book about relationship therapy. I don't know that I'm qualified to write that book, but my my gut is saying that that is a case by case basis. It's about finding something that works for you, and it's not something that I would presume to tell people what how to be in their relationships.
Okay, that's fair enough. Okay, so you're a scholar, you do academia, you also do filmmaking and art. Tell us a
Yeah.
little more about the filmmaking and art.
Yeah. I have done art and filmmaking things for a long time in my free time. I have made a number of short films with my kids that we submit to kind of local festivals. I was, have been big into music at different parts of my life. I think that what I'm doing now is, for the first time, I'm kind of marrying my personal interest in art and writing fiction with my kind of professional expertise. And so what we've done is so some of the things we're talking about, like, right, responding to racism, that they say that the research says the most common way to respond to racism in face-to-face settings is to not respond, that most people are silent. And then part of what I find in my book is that that online folks talk about responding much more frequently. And what I want to explore is, what are the barriers that people perceive that keeps them from challenging racism, and how can we bypass those barriers? And so the film that I'm working on is currently in post-production, is called
Wow.
Choose Your Own Resistance, and it was shot in 360 degrees, so it's for the virtual reality medium, and it is about the choice to challenge racism. It depicts a scenario where a young person experiences a microaggression and no one says anything, and then shows kind of a an alternate universe where something is said, and it just allows us to witness the internal dialogues that happen, the causes and consequences of responding to racism. Is also a multi-perspective film, so that we see this decision to respond or not respond from the perspective of the victim, the bystander, the microaggressor. And so it's kind of this it's a very it was a lot of fun to make. It was a collaboration, and I'm excited for it to be out in the world.
Sounds exciting. Like that sounds, and the fact that it's going to be in the meta universe, that's amazing to have that full experience. Because I think when people experience things like that, it's easier for you to recognize, oh, okay, never thought about that, never saw what the impact of responding or not responding is. And I think that people just make this unconscious decision on whether to respond or not based on whatever conditioning is happening in there, or let's not even get into some of the upbringing that we had. But I think that would be phenomenal to really make people more aware and conscious of the decision to either respond to racism or not, and to be part of the change. Because I think I'm guilty of that too. A lot of us have just sat on the sidelines, right? And for some people, it might be like, I came from Nigeria, a country that there's a lot of stuff going on there. So in a way, there's some part of me that feels thankful that I'm able to live in a different country in Canada. And so when these microaggressions do show up, there's obviously a dialogue happening in the background that I'm not even aware of. But for some reason, sometimes I choose to respond. Other times I'm just like, okay, whatever, I just walk away. But I think something like this, the film you're talking about, will probably be very helpful for people, at least to raise that level of consciousness, so that we can all kind of fight this thing together and build
Thank you.
that world, that beautiful world.
Yeah, trying to. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I wish you all the best with your film,
Thank you.
your art, and with your book. And for anyone who's interested in fighting racism, or really just if you want to learn for yourself and maybe for your children, how you can start having these conversations, how you can be part of the change that we're talking about, then get the book. I'll put the book in the show notes so that you can access the book, and we can all try to change this world together. So, Rob, what final advice do you have for people, maybe people who are going through some level of racism right now, or have in the past, and want to be part of the change?
Yeah, I would encourage folks to not do it by yourselves. And so find a community where you can, talk about your experiences, where you can learn about how other people are experiencing, what other people are experiencing, and realize that the things you're going through, you're not alone, that you're not the first person to have that experience. And that can be an online community, it can be a face-to-face community, but have those conversations. Don't keep it to yourself. And then right, and I think that the more we learn about racism, the more we understand it, the easier it will be to stand up and fight against it. And I know it can be difficult to make that decision when the stakes are high. But right, I think that being part of a community where you can bounce these ideas off of other people, I would say, is key to feeling comfortable and confident in your ability to stand up to the racism that finds you every day. Not necessarily the things you see on TV, but the things that are happening in our everyday lives.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here with us today, Rob. It was
Thank you so much for having me.
lots of wisdom, lots of things that I didn't know about, and I'm sure it will be very helpful to a lot of our listeners today. Well, that's the end of our show for this week. Thank you to everyone who's listened and joined in. I will see you same time next week on I Rise Conversations with Joan. Thanks for watching.